All right, the most interesting chapter in Wayside School Beneath the Cloud of Doom. So the cloud of doom has burst open and is shaking the building, and there's alarms going off, and all the kids have fallen down the stairs. And a teacher, who they don't really know, has ushered them into their classroom. All right, chapter 28. The teacher with the long fingernail. Guess we'll find out who that is. Anybody have any guesses? All right. Like moths, the children went to the light. Welcome, welcome, glad you're here. Come in, the woman said as they filed past and joined the other kids in her class. I'm sorry I don't have enough desks, but we'll make do. Please find a place on the floor for now. The children did as they were told. They felt safe, even if a bit uncomfortable. They could no longer feel the school shake or hear the kachuga boops. Miss Zarves, said Mrs. Jules. It's so good to see you. How long has it been? Feels like forever, said Mrs. Zarves. I never bump into you in the teacher's lounge, said Mrs. Jules. We must just keep missing each other. I try not to bump into people, said Mrs. Zarves. Okay, so if you remember from the first book, there is no Mrs. Zarves. There is no 19th story. So usually there's no 19th chapter. There was in this book. But this is chapter 28, and we have just met Mrs. Zarves. Mrs. Zarves was tall and thin. Her skirt and blouse were neat and trim. Her short hair looked shiny and silky and smelled like strawberry shampoo. Everything about her was neat and orderly, except for that one long fingernail. How's Mavis? Asked Mrs. Zarves. Mavis was Mrs. Jules's daughter. Adorable, said Mrs. Jules, but they grow up so fast, don't they? I wouldn't know, said Mrs. Zarves. You don't look like you've aged a day, said Mrs. Jules. Very nice of you to say, said Ms. Zarves. Mrs. Jules wasn't just being nice. Miss Zarves hadn't changed one bit, except for her fingernail, of course, which had grown considerably longer. Calvin walked between the two teachers. Excuse me, Miss Zarves, he said. I think I'm supposed to give this to you. He handed Miss Zarves a folded piece of paper that was so old it tore as Mrs. Zarves unfolded it. She strained to read the faded paper. So in the first book, Calvin was supposed to take a note to Mrs. Zarves, and he just went up and down the stairs because he couldn't find the 19th story and he couldn't find Mrs. Zarves, so he just kind of said he delivered it. But clearly he had kept it in his pocket this whole entire time and is now giving it to her now. Oh, okay, she said to Mrs. Jules as she dropped the note in the trash. Is that the note I gave you to give to Miss Zarves? Mrs. Jules asked Calvin. Calvin shrugged. I just found it in my pocket, he said, sounding even more surprised than Mrs. Jules. Mrs. Jules stared at him. You told me you gave it to her, she accused. I don't think I ever said that, said Calvin. Mrs. Jules continued to stare as he returned to his seat on the floor. We were just about to have our history review, said Ms. Zarves. Who's your best history student? Myron, Mrs. Jules answered without hesitation. Myron had gotten the highest score on the history portion of the ultimate test. Myron, stand up, please, said Mrs. Zarves. He stood. What kind of shoes did Mary Bopkins like to wear? Ms. Zarves asked him. Who? asked Myron. The kids from Mrs. Zarves' class giggled. No laughing, said Miss Zarves. We don't laugh at stupid people. Don't feel bad, Myron. You may be stupid now, but once you've been in my class for a few years, you'll know the history of everybody. Mark, could you please tell Myron the answer? A few years, Myron asked, but Miss Zarves ignored the question. Mark Miller stood up. Which Mary Bopkins do you mean? He asked. The one born in 1801 in Boston or the one born in 1952 in San Francisco? Boston, said Miss Zarves. Red boots, said Mark. Excellent, said Miss Zarves. Who's Mary Bopkins? asked Mrs. Jules. Was she famous? Why, said Mrs. Zarves. Does your class only study famous people? Do you think famous people are more important than people who aren't famous? But there isn't enough time to study everyone, said Ms. Jules. We don't play favorites in my class, said Ms. Zarves. She went to the back closet and took out several giant stacks of paper. This is everyone born in 1837. She went around the room handing each student a stack of of 100 pages or more. When you finish setting a page, please pass it to someone else. Myron stared helplessly at his stack. I can't even read this, he complained. I think it's Chinese. Well, yes, a lot of people were born in China, said Ms. Zarves. She handed Myron a Chinese dictionary and said, You'll need this. It is impossible to say how long Myron sat there, fumbling through the dictionary as the kids around him were passing around their sheets of paper. He might have been there an hour, or a day, or a week. He might have been there, Time passes slowly when you're trying to read a Chinese dictionary, even if you're Chinese. He glanced up and spotted a pair of scissors on Mark Miller's desk. He got an idea. Hey, Mark, can I borrow those for a sec? Myron asked. Sure, said Mark. Myron took the scissors, then walked bravely to the front of the room. He didn't know if his plan would work. In fact, it really didn't make any sense, but it was his only HOPE. Excuse me, Ms. Zarves. I can trim your fingernail for you if you'd like, he offered. My fingernail? Asked Ms. Zarves, astonished by such a suggestion. Which one? The long one on the end, said Myron. Ms. Zarves looked at her hand. Now that you mention it, it has gotten long. I guess I hadn't noticed because it grew so slowly. So in the first chapter, in chapter 27, they were adding them up and they had gotten to 999,999. So he's about to cut the millionth fingernail. She held out her hand. Myron pressed hard on the scissors and snipped it off. That does feel better, said Ms. Zarves. Thank you, Myron. Myron held the fingernail up in the air, except he was no longer standing in the front of the classroom. He was standing on the stairs, and everyone else from Mrs. Jules's class lay sprawled across the staircase. 1,000,000, he shouted triumphantly. Does her classroom really exist? He doesn't have a fingernail. Who's to say?